It had been a stifling summer in Pella in 356 BC, the air thick with expectation as Queen Olympias of Epirus neared the end of her pregnancy. The royal midwives spread rumors of sinister omens, thunderbolts and lions that had beset the queen throughout her pregnancy. Priests on palace courtyards sacrificed white bulls to Zeus, searching for favorable signs in the unborn son. Evening of July 20th, when a furious storm swept over Macedon, Olympias was in labor under the thunderclaps which appeared to break the foundations of the palace. When Alexander was born, at the very instant that this rider rode up with shattering news, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, was burnt to the ground. Historian Callisthenes would later record that goddess Artemis was so occupied with Alexander's birth that she could not guard her own temple. King Philip II was at the same time told that his general Parmenion had achieved a great victory against the Illyrians, and that his favorite stallion had given birth to a first-rate colt. The confluence of these events meant that the Macedonian court was convinced this was no ordinary child. The seer to the king Aristander of Telmessos examined the infant and declared that he bore the mark of kings, a tiny birthmark shaped like a lion on his shoulder. When the infant Alexander grasped for a ceremonial sword offered to him, the priests interpreted this action as a sign that he would be a great military conqueror. Queen Olympias, tracing her own descent back to Achilles through her Molossian ancestry, quietly began teaching her son that he was to be worthy of superlatives beyond men's measure. On the distant side in Athens, the philosopher Aristotle, himself teaching Hermias of Atanius at the time, noticed unusual planetary conjunctions that night, which he would later connect with his most famous student's birth. The royal entourage was at Amphipolis for the summer horse fair, when the great black stallion was led before King Philip. Bucephalus, named because he sported an ox-head brand, had thrown away every seasoned horseman, rolling his eyes wildly at attempts to mount him. The 10-year-old Alexander noticed what others did not. The horse was frightened of its own shadow. While nobles smiled at the boy's temerity, Alexander made his fabled wager with his father. If he could not ride Bucephalus, he would give his father the exorbitant 13-talent price out of his own pocket. Young Alexander approached the snorting stallion slowly, leading him around so the sun fell on him and thereby eliminate the shadow. Softly speaking in the Thessalian horse whisperer's language he had been taught by his mother's people, Alexander stroked the animal's neck before leaping onto its back. For a few tense minutes, the horse bucked and spun, but the prince gripped on, his tiny hands knotted in the thick mane. Only when Bucephalus finally quieted, sweat-stained and panting, did the crowds of assembled Macedonians break out into cheers. This moment would enter legend, with court historian Ptolemy later writing that it was then that Philip first really saw the potential in his son. The king had supposedly wept with pride, telling Alexander, "My son, seek a kingdom worthy of you, for Macedon is not spacious enough." Bucephalus would remain Alexander's faithful warhorse for nearly 2 decades on 3 continents. The stallion's training ground in the vicinity of Amphipolis would become sanctified ground, on which young Macedonian nobles would later come to try their own mettle. Alexander was dispatched at the age of 13 to the distant groves of Mieza, where the philosopher Aristotle had established an open-air academy. The glade, where plane trees were planted and natural springs bubbled forth, was titled the School of Kings. Here, Aristotle modified his lectures to meet his royal student, mixing philosophy with practical statecraft. The philosopher also instructed Alexander in Homer's works, medicine, horticulture, and even oratory. Although hot-headed Prince allegedly complained at having to learn good speech, since a sword would make the same point better. Much of their coursework was absorbed while walking through the woods, as Aristotle used nature itself as school. He taught Alexander that a king must be lion-like, brave without being reckless, powerful but not cruel. The prince took an interest in biology, exporting specimens back to Pella from every campaign he would later undertake. Most importantly, Aristotle taught the Greek ideal of arete, virtue in everything. This education would shape Alexander's ambition to bring Greek and Persian cultures together in his conquests. But tensions developed between teacher and student over Persia. Whereas Aristotle viewed the Persians as barbarians to be conquered, Alexander was more refined. Their final farewell in 340 BC was polite but cold, and Alexander gave Aristotle 800 talents, enough to finance his own lyceum in Athens. Years later, when Alexander discovered that his former tutor had published their private discussions, he wrote a biting letter reminding Aristotle that teaching and practicing are not the same, demonstrating how thoroughly he had mastered and then transcended his mentor's teachings. It was the 7th day of wedding celebrations of Alexander's sister Cleopatra to his uncle Alexander of Epirus when tragedy struck. King Philip entered the defenseless Aigai theatre, wanting to show his people that he was approachable. As he stood between the two statues of the gods of Olympus, his bodyguard Pausanias shoved his way through and stabbed him in the ribs with a Celtic dagger. The assassin tripped in his getaway and was immediately speared by 3 of the royal guardsmen. In the chaos, Prince Alexander swiftly secured the palace, while his mother Olympias allegedly ensured there were no other competitors to the throne who survived the night. The investigation revealed a plot of at least 6 noble households and perhaps even Alexander's half-brother Aridaeus, who was mentally challenged. What had begun as a personal feud of Pausanias, Philip had not responded to his plea for justice when he was sexually mistreated by Attilus's men, had been exploited by Persian gold and Macedonian rivals. Alexander responded with lethal effectiveness, executing all suspects, including 2 princes of the Lyncestian royal house, while tactically sparing their 3rd brother, who was one of his most senior generals. Within a few days, 20-year-old Alexander was proclaimed king by the assembly of the army. His first act was to pay a solitary nocturnal visit to Philip's tomb, where witnesses claimed to have heard him swear an oath to surpass even your shadow, father. Next morning, he appeared before the soldiers in Philip's distinctive white-plumed helmet, signaling continuity as well as his determination to outdo his father's feats. When Thebes rebelled shortly after Alexander's accession on rumors of his death in Illyria, the young king marched 300 miles in just 13 days, an impossibility, it was believed. Arriving unexpectedly at the city gates, he offered mercy if they would surrender. Secure behind their legendary 7-gated walls, the Thebans mocked him as a boy king and paraded Macedonian prisoners along the ramparts. What followed would be Alexander's first demonstration of absolute war. The assault was begun at dawn, with Alexander himself leading the crack shield bearers through an unfortified section near the Electra Gate. Within, his troops systematically destroyed the city district by district. Over 6,000 Thebans died in the street fighting, their bodies piled in gruesome pyramids amidst the rubble. The surviving 30,000 were sold into slavery, except for priests, descendants of the poet Pindar, and those who had opposed the rebellion. Every building except the sacred temples was demolished, with Alexander ordering the earth salted so nothing might grow there again. The psychological impact was both deliberate and appalling. When Athens immediately sent envoys apologizing for mercy, Alexander spared them, demonstrating he could also be merciful if approached correctly. The gold from the Theban sack financed his Asian campaign, and the captive craftsmen were sent to Macedon to upgrade local expertise. Above all, Greece now understood this was no ordinary ruler, a message which would echo throughout Persia when news reached Darius's court. Alexander was 22 years of age, standing on the European side of the Hellespont, the sea channel between Greece and Persian territory. In a carefully choreographed reenactment of the Trojan War, he set out across Asia not as a conqueror, but as a new Achilles, thrusting his spear into Asian soil and claiming the continent won by the spear. As his initial move, he landed at Troy, where he anointed himself in sacred oil and exchanged his armor for booty from the days of the Trojan War, binding his campaign to Homeric legend. Macedonian forces had 32,000 infantry and 5,100 cavalry, tiny by Persian standards, but perfectly trained. Parmenion already had a beachhead, but Alexander required them to start again for political reasons. When his ship grounded, he leaped into the shallow water wearing full armor, near drowning before guards pulled him to safety, a later mythologized incident as intentional, showing his willingness to suffer with the soldiers. The Persians, observing from neighboring hills, reportedly taunted the little army until they noticed its perfect discipline. This was the actual beginning of Alexander's legend. He left 12,000 men to be left in Greece by Antipater, while rounding up nearly all of Macedon's fighting strength to carry east, a gamble mirroring his absolute confidence. The night before the first Battle of Granicus, Alexander slept along with ordinary soldiers and not in his tent, telling them, "Tomorrow we dine either in Persia or in Hades." Words that would help describe his leadership style as frontline leadership and sharing all risks. Day dawned over the dry plains of Gaugamela to reveal Darius III's 250,000-strong army stretching out to the horizon. War elephants, scythed chariots, and the legendary immortals glittering in the dawn light. Alexander's 47,000 Macedonians stood firm in perfect formation, having spent the night in armor so that they might not endure another night attack by Darius at Issus. The golden youth in a sparkling silver breastplate and white-plumed helmet rode Bucephalus down the lines, calling back each corps to their earlier victories. Alexander's mastery was seen in the initial maneuvers of the battle. He moved obliquely forward intentionally, luring the Persian left wing out of position. As Darius launched his scythed chariots, the Macedonians simply created gaps to permit them to ride through harmlessly before killing the drivers. The turning point was when Alexander employed his cavalry to create a wedge and ride directly into Darius's position, not to kill him, but to cause him to retreat. When Persian morale dissolved, Alexander wheeled round to rescue Parmenion's hard-pressed left flank, demonstrating his complete mastery of the battlefield. The sequel was that Alexander was acclaimed King of Asia by his men. Alexander occupied Darius's abandoned chariot, royal cloak, and 4,000 talents of gold. But most rewarding to him was psychological. Gaugamela shattered Persian resistance once and for all. When he captured Babylon weeks afterward, its people greeted him with flowers rather than bullets, beginning his policy of adopting Persian customs that would eventually alienate his Macedonian officers. Its legacy endures in military academies everywhere as the definitive demonstration of tactical brilliance defeating numerical superiority. After 12 years of undefeated campaigns across 22,000 miles, Alexander was dying in Nebuchadnezzar's palace at the age of 32. The man who had imbibed from the fountain of immortality in Persian myth could no longer bring himself to drink water. His final days were filled with omens, a stranger on his throne, ravens fighting over the gates of the palace, and most ominously of all, when he was asked to whom he should leave his empire, his whispered reply, "To the strongest." The funeral cortege that returned his gold-encased body to Macedon became a legendary cortege in its own right. Ptolemy hijacked it to Egypt, and Alexander was interred in Alexandria, his final city among the 70 he had established. His empire disintegrated immediately among his generals, But his legacy endured in the Hellenistic world he created, blending Greek and Eastern culture for centuries. Perhaps the greatest tribute was paid 2,300 years later, when a young Napoleon Bonaparte stood before Alexander's tomb and whispered, "I cannot forgive him for being first." From Caesar to Churchill, all the great leaders would measure themselves against the boy from Pella who conquered the known world before his 33rd birthday and changed the course of civilization forever.